Chairman Hall, Representative O'Brien, Chairman Height, it's good to see you, sir. Leader Cafaro, and it's great to have Jack Serra back into the General Assembly. Welcome back. And members of this special committee hearing, good morning. I am Tom Stewart. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Ohio Oil and Gas Association, which is a state-based trade association representing the common interest of over 1,900 members who are engaged in the exploration and production of crude oil and natural gas within the state of Ohio. We've represented this industry since 1947. Today's hearing is focused on the Underground Injection Control Program authorized under the landmark federal law, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the UIC relationship to seismic activity, and the development of the resource shale play. I will direct my comments to the regulatory approaches that govern the development of reliable and efficient energy, as well as the economic engine, the jobs that are being realized from development of this resource. My comments will focus on how these events are impacting Ohio, the relationship between federal and state-based regulatory policy, and the process that validates the long-standing principle that the states are best suited to regulate the industry in order to protect the public interest and ensure protection of human health, safety, and the environment. Some background on here in Ohio. For over a century and a half, Ohio has been blessed with a production of plentiful oil and natural gas resources. At each critical point in our history, it has been changes wrought by technology that have provided to the producers the ability to explore new horizons and expand the resource base. Today, the ability to horizontally drill a deep underground reservoir with exacting precision, exponentially exposing the face of the reservoir rock to the wellbore, has created massive efficiencies in our ability to produce oil and gas. Horizontal drilling has been a process that's been around for about 20 years and has been deployed now in many of the basins across the United States. Ohio is now beginning a new era of oil and gas exploration made possible by technology that is unlocking reservoirs that until now were not accessible. For our entire history, we explored for oil and gas from reservoirs where it had been trapped, after migrating over the eons from source rocks where oil and gas have been formed and cooked in nature's kitchen. Now we are drilling into the actual source rocks where most geologists believe 95% of the oil and gas still remains in place even after feeding the traps that have produced all the oil and gas that we have found to date. This is a radical departure in America's understanding of energy dependency and the availability of reliable and efficient energies. Even so, we have been drilling Devonian shale wells for well over 100 years in the state of Ohio. The resource shale play will reset the clock on available domestic oil and natural gas resources. Some comments on the economic impact. Already, shale production has fundamentally changed domestic energy markets. Today, the industry is providing the American consumer an incredible energy bargain, providing natural gas priced at 22% of its intrinsic energy value, a trend that the marketplace indicates will continue into the future. It's also enticing the chemical industry to re-enter the United States and build new chemical manufacturing facilities because they will have access to super competitive and plentiful feedstock, jump-starting the job growth downstream of the wellhead. What does this mean for Ohio? Since 1860, Ohio has produced over 8.5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 1.14 billion barrels of crude oil. The state's geologists recently provided a volumetric calculation to estimate the recoverable reserve potential of the Utica Shale, Ohio's shale opportunity. He reported that should producers extract 5% of the oil and gas in place, leaving 95% of the resource in the rock, the Utica could generate 15.7 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 5.5 billion barrels of crude oil. That is an astonishing number and perhaps a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Ohio. An economic impact study commissioned by the Ohio Oil and Gas Energy Education Program determined that the Utica Shale will lead to the creation of over 200,000 Ohio-based jobs over the next 5 years to support the leasing, development, production, and pipeline construction. Investments by oil and gas companies will reach $34 billion to fund development, activity, and infrastructure. Producing wells are projected to generate $1.6 billion of royalty income to Ohio landowners and increase tax revenues of $478 million. Perhaps most significantly, the Utica Shale can make Ohio a net exporter of energy, providing locally produced and low-cost energy supplies to Ohio industry for decades. Coupled with the readily available and affordable energy resource, the expansion of job growth suggests that development of the Utica Shale may be the most significant positive economic event to take place in Ohio for decades. The principal regulatory authority managing the environmental risk associated with oil and natural gas production are state agencies acting under state law or as the delegated regulator under federal law. To put the regulatory process in context, it is useful to understand some key elements of developing a well and generating production. Except on federally owned resources, the regulatory responsibility rests with the state oil and gas agencies for permitting, well construction, and completion. These agencies set the standard that must be met in drilling a well, such as location limits, construction standards, including steel casing and cementing requirements, and surface management requirements. Well construction requirements are particularly significant because they are the principal methods of protecting against groundwater contamination. By creating a barrier between the groundwater and the wellbore, oil and other chemicals from the well cannot move into water formations, and water cannot move into the wellbore. This technological approach has been used effectively for 75 years and is continually improved. Well completion regulations determine the management of technologies to stimulate production from oil and natural gas containing formations. Hydraulic fracturing is a well stimulation technology. Consequently, since its invention in the late 1940s, its use has been regulated by state oil and natural gas agencies. Throughout the past 6 decades, this regulatory structure has effectively protected against the environmental risk of fracturing without the involvement or intervention of the federal government. Proposals that the federal government needs to insert itself into well construction and completion regulations fail to show that any justification exists, suggesting a failure of the current state regulatory process or that federal government has either the expertise or the capacity to regulate 35,000 or more wells that are drilled annually in the United States. In fact, where the federal government does have regulatory authority related to oil and natural gas production, it relies on the state regulators to conduct the daily regulatory effort. Federal environmental laws apply to oil and natural gas production activities when waste is generated. Most specifically, with regard to the development of emerging shale gas and shale oil formations, the applicable federal law addresses the disposal of produced waters, including frac flowback water, under the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act. The applicability of the law depends on the disposition of the produced water. Produced water injected underground is regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Produced water discharged to the surface is regulated under the Clean Water Act. The Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act operate similarly. The federal government creates a national framework, but the laws rely on state regulators to bear the larger permitting burden through the delegation of that role from the Environmental Protection Agency. With respect to Safe Drinking Water Act, regulation of underground injection is defined by the Underground Injection Control Program. The UICIE program creates a series of classes for different types of injection wells. Class 2 applies to oil and natural gas production. In 1980, Congress modified Safe Drinking Water Act to allow for primacy under the law to be granted to states for Class 2 programs based on equivalent effectiveness rather than adoption of the specific EPA regulations. Most oil and natural gas producing states with active underground injection operations have primacy based on equivalency with or more stringent than the federal program. Class 2 wells can either be used for disposition of water or for reinjection in formations as a type of secondary recovery to increase production. Only water produced from oil and gas wells can be injected in Class 2 wells, nothing else. And if something was, that would be a violation of Safe Drinking Water Act and the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. According to EPA, the use of injection wells was documented as early as 300 AD, and large-scale commercial use of injection wells in the United States began in the 1930s. The oil and gas industry isn't the only industry that has used injection wells as a safe and well-regulated disposal means. Other industrial sectors that rely on injection wells include chemicals, manufacturing, food and agriculture, plastics, metal, and steel. Ohio is home to 10 so-called Class 1 wells that accept concentrated high-toxicity waste generated by industrial processes. Ohio hosts 58 Class 3 disposal wells that accepts fluids used to dissolve and extract minerals such as uranium, salt, copper, and sulfur. Today, there are over 144,000 Class II wells in operation within the United States. On average, those wells accept more than 2 billion gallons of water per day that is associated with oil and natural gas development. Clearly, without the delegation of this program to state regulatory bodies, the federal law would be virtually incapable of implementation. In 1983, U.S. EPA delegated primacy authority to Ohio to run the UIC program. As the host of the oil and gas regulatory program, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources received the authority to manage the Class II program. Under the primacy agreement, the ODNR issues U.S. UIC permits for Class II wells, but U.S. EPA sets the standard for construction, maintenance, and continuous monitoring of the Class II wells. The Ohio UIC program is regularly audited by U.S. EPA and has undergone peer reviews conducted by the Groundwater Protection Council. In December 1984, the Ohio General Assembly, the 115th, enacted Substitute House Bill 501 that set in place standards for the storage and disposal of brines, called at that time, formation saltwater or produced waters from oil and gas production wells. According to federal standards, produced waters are the combination of formation water and water that has been injected into the formation either for well stimulation purposes or secondary recovery processes. Produced water is generally ubiquitous in character, represents a low toxicity but high volume waste stream, and therefore is not classified as a hazardous waste under the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. State Representative Robert E. Hagan was the lead sponsor of House Bill 501, which served as the Assembly's response to an authentic environmental problem. Up until then, produced waters were often captured and stored in evaporation pits. This practice led to widespread pollution of drinking water resources. House Bill 501 banned the use of evaporation pits, and justifiably so. It then required that all oil and gas related produced waters be disposed of using the best and most preferred method under the landmark federal laws. Class II injection that permanently impounds the waste stream back into the same formation it came from or deeper. Interesting enough, HB 501 at introduction contemplated a moratorium on oil and gas wells until the state of Ohio could actually certify that a sufficient number of UIC wells existed to manage the brine that was being then produced. 501 also set registration and reporting requirements for brine haulers. HB 501 led to large-scale cleanup of damage caused by oil field practices that existed at that time and was a much-needed environmental improvement. Except for a minor amount used by local governments for dust and ice control, it is the law of the state of Ohio that all oil and gas-related produced water must be disposed of using a Class II UIC well constructed to the federal standards. Since that time, the industry has built up a network of Class II wells along the breadth of eastern Ohio to service the needs of oil and gas producers who must comply with Ohio law. Currently, there are 181 Class II injection wells operating in Ohio, or 0.12% of the nation's total population of such wells. The Ohio wells accept about 1.303 million gallons of produced waters per day, or less than 0.05% of the total nationwide volume. It is important to put the recent events in Mahoning County into context with the wider use and track record of Class II wells existing in Ohio. Lately in Mahoning County, there's been a series of localized seismicity that, after reasonable analysis, has generated concern that may be related to a recently installed UIC Class II well. We accept that these are rational concerns. The well in question is a deep injection well for which the total depth penetrates into the granite basement rock lying below the deepest sedimentary rock known as the Mount Simon Sandstone, a formation with sufficient porosity and permeability to serve as an effective disposal reservoir. Many Class I and Class II wells target the Mount Simon Formation. We acknowledge that the concerns may be related to a yet-to-be-determined geologic anomaly, likely a minor slip-strike fault, which is two blocks moving against each other in opposite directions, lying within the crystalline basement rock. According to experts, in order for the injectate to cause a seismic event, a fault must already exist that has existing stress on it to the point that it is already near failure. The injectate alleviates pore pressure to, in effect, lubricate the already near failure fault and cause it to slip. Earthquakes are the abrupt movement of sections of the earth that release vibrational energy. They are the result of plate tectonics and the fact that the crust of the earth is composed of pieces that move, bump, and generally cause stress upon one another. One way that the rock of these plates responds to stress is by cracking, faulting. These plates are everywhere, and earthquakes can happen anywhere. This is nature. Earthquakes are measured on the Richter scale, a logarithmic scale that means each measurement is 10 times greater than the measurement preceding it. Large earthquakes are rare but can cause massive damage. Small earthquakes are continuous but release insignificant energy. Quakes in the 4.0 to 4.9 range are considered light and occur somewhere nearly once an hour. Quakes in the range of 3.0 to 3.9 are considered minor and occur somewhere 15 times per hour. Quakes in the range of 2.0 to 2.9 are also minor and occur 2 per minute, and those less than 2.0 occur continually. Roughly 1.3 million 2 to 2.9 magnitude quakes happen every year around the world. The majority of quakes associated with the Mahoney County were in the 2.0 to 2.9 range. Experts say that several of them were not felt at the surface. Having said that, I do not minimize the concern Mahoney County citizens have with this event. I would no more want my home in Fairfield County, home of the Discovery Well in the Clinton Sand, shaking any more than they do. That's why we supported the Kasich administration's decision to temporarily suspend operations at this well and other projects within a radius of this well. It was the correct and prudent course of action to ensure the safety and peace of mind of area residents. This is evidence of an effective regulatory agency. We also believe the situation in Youngstown is a rare and isolated event that should not cast doubt about the effectiveness or usage of Class II injection wells, which has been used safely and reliably as a disposal method for wastewater from oil and gas operations in the United States since the 1930s, and is the preferred method for oil field waste management under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Even so, there have been some statements made that serve only to confuse the situation and are designed to create fear and uncertainty with the oil and gas development process. Opponents of the oil and gas development have been quick and insistent to claim that the Mahoney County UIC well is related to hydraulic fracturing. The North Star UIC well was not hydraulically fractured. It is not a producing facility. The event is not related to the process of hydraulic fracturing. People who say otherwise are working to create fear using a broadly spoken term for a process that, to this day, the public has scant fundamental knowledge, even though it has been used in the oil field over 1.2 million times, and in Ohio 80,000 times over a 60-year time frame. The North Star UICOL was constructed and operating in full compliance with the permit conditions. A geologic anomaly is at the root of this problem, not the well. We need experts to fully understand the specific problem, learn from it, and then adjust regulatory policy accordingly to avoid future problems. Opponents of oil and gas development have, in this case and elsewhere, stated that the industry is exempt from federal regulation. Again, this is an attempt to politicize the process. In regard to this, recall that the Safe Drinking Water Act sets standards for public water supplies, including establishment of the Underground Injection Control Program, a process that has the specific purpose to permanently dispose by impoundment of a waste in an appropriate underground reservoir. Hydraulic fracturing is a well completion procedure designed to induce permeability in a low-perm oil and gas reservoir by creating a fracture, a pathway through the targeted reservoir rock to more readily allow the oil and gas to move through the reservoir and into the wellbore to then be lifted to the surface. With few exceptions, it is a one-time procedure. It is never an ongoing procedure like Class I or Class II injection. It is not the disposal of a waste stream. In fact, it is done to make a well capable of production in order to efficiently withdraw in commercial quantities product from the rock, including the water that was used during the frac job. There have been anti-oil and gas organizations that have attempted to construct an argument that fracturing is the same thing as Class II injection of produced waters and should be regulated as such under Safe Drinking Water Act. That argument is an attempt to fit a square peg in a round hole, and it fails by virtue of the various definitions of the processes being discussed. Congress never had the intention of regulating a well stimulation process under Safe Drinking Water Act as a waste disposal process. In 2005, Congress clarified that view by simply stating in the 2005 Energy Policy Act that hydraulic fracturing, or storage gas injection for that matter, is not underground injection. Congress did not exempt the industry from Safe Drinking Water Act as others claim. In fact, industry's produced water waste streams are specifically regulated as Class II injection and fully covered under Safe Drinking Water Act. There is no loophole. The language is definitional and straightforward. Nowhere does it say that the oil and gas industry and its activities that are relevant to the Act are exempted from Safe Drinking Water Act regulation. Some people are making allegations that radioactive waste are being injected into the ground. The radioactive waste referenced are not what they would lead you to believe. NORM, or naturally occurring radioactive material, is part of everyday life. It even occurs in our bodies with radioactive potassium. You can find it in public drinking water, Brazil nuts, peanut butter, or the air. If you have a granite kitchen tabletop, you have a NORM issue. On average, Americans receive a radiation dose of about 0.62 rem each year. But if you're unfortunate enough to have dentures, they can add another 1,600 milliram to a person's exposure level. None of these levels are dangerous to human health. A radiological survey report by the Co-Physics Corporation in New York recently concluded the rock cuttings from the gas drilling operations that sampled during this project have radionuclide levels that do not pose any environmental health problem, even if they were deposited in areas accessible to the general public. Therefore, they are certainly acceptable for landfill disposal. The New York State Department Environmental Conservation study titled Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement on the Oil and Gas and Solution Mining Regulatory Program that was completed in September of last year stated that based upon current available information, it is anticipated that flowback water would not contain levels of NORM of significance. The Ohio Department of Health has actually tested produced waters and cuttings to determine if the levels of NORM are dangerous to human health. All the produced water and cuttings tested fell below levels harmful to human health. There is no concern in regards to radiation from the disposal of produced waters or cuttings. Much concern has been voiced regarding the volume of produced waters from other states that's being injected into Ohio UIC wells. And in fact, the volume from such sources is notably increasing. First, let me say that the OGA is first in line expressing concerns that out-of-state brine volumes may stress the capacity of UIC wells to manage the produced waters from existing Ohio oil and gas wells. We believe that other states should work to develop solutions within their own states to manage issues related to their own industries. Ohio, just like other states, must accept produced water from other states because of the Dormant Commerce Clause, which is part of the Interstate Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution. The Dormant Commerce Clause prohibits the state from passing legislation that improperly burdens or discriminates against interstate commerce. The best example of the Dormant Commerce Clause goes back to Philadelphia versus New Jersey, in which the Supreme Court ordered New Jersey to accept waste, liquid or solid, from other states. This is not a state issue. We are federally obligated to accept waste from other states, be it solid waste like trash or liquid waste like produced waters. The operation of oil and natural gas wells have been regulated since the 1920s with an increasing emphasis on environmental controls since the 1960s. This regulation has been and continues to be done effectively by the states, a reality that has been recognized by the Congress and by the EPA. Because of the diversity of conditions associated with oil and natural gas production, the regulatory process must be flexible and reflect the unique conditions in a state or area within a state. It requires the technical expertise that has been developed in each state and which does not exist within the EPA. For this reason, federal laws generally defer to the states for the regulation of this industry. The Groundwater Protection Council is an organization of state groundwater regulatory agencies which comes together to mutually work toward the protection of the nation's groundwater supplies. The purpose of GWPC is to promote and ensure the use of best management practices and fair but effective laws regarding comprehensive groundwater protection. In August of 2011, Groundwater Protection Council issued a report that investigated the regulatory history of Texas and Ohio as it relates to oil and natural gas production and protection of groundwater resources. The report conclusively demonstrates that the state regulatory agencies within these states, both significant oil and gas producing states, have prioritized regulatory reforms and strategically applied resources to improve standards that reduce risk associated with state-specific compliance issues. Over time, both Ohio and Texas have strategically enhanced regulatory standards for state-specific oil and gas E&P activities that have been found to cause groundwater contamination incidents. In other words, the states have made consistent ongoing improvements to protect the environment and the public interest that is tailored to each individual state's characteristics and needs. Also, over time, the states have engaged in a process that corroborates their regulatory abilities, identifies regulatory gaps, and provides a process to close those gaps and improve their respective regulatory programs. The State Review of Oil and Natural Gas Environmental Regulations, known as STRONGER, is an independent stakeholder governing body that manages the state review process. The overall objective of the state review process is to help state oil and gas regulatory programs improve. The key innovative aspect of the state review process are that teams made up of equal representation from the environmental community, state regulators, and industry come together to conduct an authentic peer review critique of the state's regulatory program, benchmarking the program against a national set of guidelines that itemize the critical elements necessary to protect the public interest in the environment. This process represents a stakeholder-driven collaborative effort working together to develop a regulatory framework at the state level that effectively protects the environment while recognizing the unique historic, geologic, and topographic characteristics of oil and gas development among the states. Stronger recently updated the review of guidelines to include a specific section focused on hydraulic fracturing. Over the past year, Stronger has done fact-specific reviews in 6 states, in Ohio following the implementation of the new law, Senate Bill 165. Stronger conducted a state review specific to hydraulic fracturing in Ohio. The review concluded that the Ohio program was overall well-managed, professional, and meeting its program objectives. And that report was signed off on by the environmental community. The Secretary of Energy Advisory Board's Shale Gas Production Subcommittee interim report and the recent National Petroleum Report on shale gas has specifically commended the state review process. The state review process demonstrates that the states are the best and most efficient point to regulate the industry's waste streams. The process provides for a system of constant improvement and an opportunity to share and promote new or unique regulatory concepts among the states while maintaining the flexibility needed to meet individual states' needs. Injection of produced water deep underground into formations that already contain formation water using wells regulated to federal standards has proven to be safe, effective, and a preferred means for protecting the environment. When such activity interacts with the deep geological anomaly to cause the exceedingly rare events we have witnessed recently in Ohio, then regulatory experts need to take action to correct the specific situation. That has happened. Unfortunately, some of the people speaking with the loudest voices right now in opposition to UIC wells appear to be people with the least awareness of the history of facts associated with the UIC program as it exists in Ohio, or have the least willingness to provide a balanced perspective to the facts. We respect the administration's decision to suspend operations in the impacted area until more facts come to light. Our industry is committed to ensuring that this matter is resolved in a proper manner with facts and not hyperbole, informing any decisions that will be made in the future. That concludes my comments, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. I appreciate your testimony. We'll have questions from the panel. Ma'am, we have questions for the panel. Representative O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. I have a question. In Ohio right now we have, it's my understanding, 177 injection wells operating today as we speak. Is that correct?
My last count was 181, Representative, but you'll probably see on the official site 177.
Okay. And the concern is we have a well, in Ohio we have earthquakes, but we only have about 4 or 5 a year, is my understanding. Since this well in Youngstown was brought online within a year, we have over 11 earthquakes, with one being at a 4.0 on the Richter scale. With 11 earthquakes happening within a year, within the epicenter being close to that well, is there something that this well is doing different? Is it deeper than most wells? What is the problem as you see it?
Mr. Chairman, Representative O'Brien, Dave Hill is with me. He is an operator of several UIC wells across the state of Ohio, and I'll ask him to jump in any time to answer those kinds of technical questions. Anytime you wish, Dave. But the answer to your question is that this well was drilled down to the basement rock. It could go no further and find sedimentary rock, but it's often common to drill down and through the Mount Simon in order to find the best injectate zone. You want to add to that, Dave?
The only other thing Chairman, it's David Hill. The only thing I would add to that is the Mount Simon sandstone is used quite common in Ohio for injection zones. Also, Class 1 injection wells use the Mount Simon sandstone.
But in the follow-up, the fact is that this well TD'd at about 9,200 feet. It is several hundred feet into the basement rock, and could they interacted with some kind of minor fault system? I think that's very plausible.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. To the witness, is there any seismic drilling or testing done before we stimulate these wells to determine whether or not there's a fault line or if there's any irregularity? I mean, is this systematic to every injection well? We have 177 or 181, whatever the number is, but we're not seeing a problem there. Is this systematic to this one well? Is it the geological formation? And are we testing for that before we begin this process so it doesn't happen again?
Mr. Chairman, I'll let Dave Hill answer that question.
Currently, right now, we are not required to run seismic surveys prior to the permitting process. And as I understand it, there are, and I may stand corrected if someone else has a different, but right now, no states in the United States require seismic surveys prior to the siting of a Class 2 injection well.
Seismic surveys is an exploratory technique to try to find structure, try to find oil and gas traps. It's like a sonogram of a baby, only in this case the baby is Mother Earth.
But that being said, don't you think that if we're looking for a fault line before we drill into one, because that would be a very big concern of ours and our constituents, is check before we drill and do the seismic testing so we know what's down there before we do it, because if we just drill and we don't know what's there, we could have more earthquakes than what we have.
I think that's a rational concern. Mr. Chairman, Representative O'Brien, I think that's a reasonable path to investigate. Often seismic lines are run across UIC wells. But remember, what a seismic survey does, even 3D surveys, is try to map structure. They try to identify structure to find oil and gas traps. I think that it's very plausible that even if you did a 3D survey across this prospect here in Mahoning County, whether you would see this fault, I think is very debatable.
My understanding of a 3D is it wouldn't show it. What would be more appropriate is to actually drill a test line down there and get a sample or do it along that way. My understanding of 3D probably would not have showed up any fault line of what was occurring or may have occurred here in Youngstown.
Seismic testing is done on the surface of the earth. You don't go down into the well to do seismic surveys. It's sound technology on the surface of the earth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead if
Do
you
you have a comment, Dave?
The only comment I would make to that is a 3D seismic survey can cover a large area. And again, Tom is correct. The surveys are taken on the surface of the earth. We're sending sound waves through, and they're bouncing back, and we get an image. Going to your point about should we actually drill a physical hole in the ground to see if we encounter that fracture, the chances of actually maybe encountering a fracture are minuscule. And if we're going to look for these things, I think running a seismic survey would be much more advantageous than as opposed to drilling a hole in the ground to looking for it. I think we're more likely to find those features. Again, we're drilling a hole in the ground, we're sampling that particular column. And a seismic survey would cover a larger area.
Yeah, a hole in the ground gives you a sample of what's happening in underground formations in an 8-inch area.
You have to excuse my ignorance. I didn't know if a core sample might be more.
It wouldn't show you that,
helpful.
Representative.
I knew 3D, I'm talking 3D.
I see where you're going.
3D might not show it as well.
No, core sampling is the process of going down through that 8-inch, generally an 8-inch hole that reaches down to TD. It starts as big as 15, but 8-inch is the length and breadth of the production string of the well. When you core it, you're actually lifting out that 8-inch plug. It's not going to show you the fault. Big seismic surveys, you can go and you look at them, and I have, and you can see some major faults. And we have mapped major faults all around Ohio. In this event, it would be my opinion, sir, that if we wanted to duplicate what happened on the North Star well, we would never get there, because this is a very minor fault system that slipped. It was near failure anyways.
Thank you very much,
Sorry,
Mr.
Senator.
Chairman. To the witnesses, I do have several questions, so I'm just going to go through your testimony and start off. My first question, Mr. Chairman, to the witness is, do you know what the penalty would be for violating the Safe Drinking Water Act at the federal level?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cafaro, it would be severe if you violate the Safe Drinking Water Act, because U.S. EPA would step in. They would also expect the state of Ohio, who has primacy on this specific program, to also enforce the law in the state of Ohio that they have delegated to them. And in Senate Bill 165, there was whole clauses in 165 that dramatically improved the enforcement capabilities of the Oil and Gas Regulatory Agency, giving them the ability to immediately remove the ability of an operator if he is in violation of the law, suspend his ability to do anything, and immediately bring charges against him and get corrective action.
Mr. Chairman, just as a follow-up to that, you said they would be severe. Could you clarify severe? How do you, severe to whom? I would assume it would be severe to the operator. And is there an associated monetary fine associated with that? And how does one determine that level of violation?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cafaro, if the Safe Drinking Water Act were violating the state of Ohio, U.S. EPA would expect the Oil and Gas Regulatory Program, the DNR, to pursue that. After 165, they have the ability to ramp up very, very large fines in the hundreds of thousands of dollars if necessary. I am not sure exactly how that is calculated.
Okay.
For example, the well in Bainbridge,
Yeah.
which I think is where you're going, I'm not sure what the fine was, but it was massive.
Mr. Chairman, to the witness, I was actually not going there, but
No.
Bainbridge,
to think ahead.
Bainbridge was in 2005, and Senate Bill 165 was passed at the end of 2009. So
Right.
as far as I'm concerned, they're two separate issues.
But they
anyway.
applied the fines.
That's fine. We'll move on. My next question, Mr. Chairman, is you mentioned that it was explicitly defined that the Class 2 wells are not exempt from federal law. Do you know the section of the U.S. Code that actually explicitly states the definitions of which the Class 2 wells need to adhere to, and where we can locate the fact that this is not a loophole?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cafaro, I knew I should have copied that off. I have it. and
Some
I'll be-
people really love reading U.S. Code, Mr. Chairman.
It's actually just...
That would be me.
Yeah. Boy, that's bizarre.
I also love C-SPAN.
It's actually just one sentence, and I'll be happy to send it to you.
I would
have it on my
appreciate it, Mr.
computer.
Chairman. My next question, Mr. Chairman, to the witness is you referenced the fact that the Ohio Department of Health tested the water to identify if the norm levels were dangerous. Can you tell the committee when and where ODH did the norm inspections?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cafaro, you would have to ask the Ohio Department of Natural Resources that. They're the ones that worked with the Department of Health to get it done. I believe it's been done over the past year and a half.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, we will certainly make sure that
we can chase that too.
That we do that. My next question, Mr. Chairman, I'm trying to run through these because I have several. Do you know if federal law differentiates the geographically based diverse geological, do they differentiate based on the diverse geological circumstances? So, you know, when we talked about the groundwater protection and et cetera, does the federal law explicitly determine if there are different rules based on the geological formations that obviously our nation from sea to shining sea is very diverse in that regard?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cafaro, when they reopened the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act in the 1980s, environmental groups sued U.S. EPA to make them pursue a regulatory determination to determine whether the industry was regulated under the Subtitle C of Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. EPA then conducted a study and it gave a regulatory report to the United States Congress, which the United States Congress adopted when they reauthorized RCRA. The United States Congress, based upon the recommendation from U.S. EPA, determined that each state, because of its geologic, as I mentioned, topographic,
Right.
Geographical, all the different characteristics of both the industry that's operating in that state or the geology that drives that industry or any of the number of factors that differentiates us would drive that regulation down to the state level. And therefore, under RCRA, Subtitle C, which is the hazardous waste clause, said that the oil and gas industry should be regulated at the state level, and that's the best place to do it, so long as the states recognize that there's gaps in regulatory policy and work to improve those gaps. The stronger process that I described to you near the end of my testimony is a 20-year-old process that arose out of the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, the governors of the producing states, to initiate that process, and that's been ongoing since that time. So yes, when they reauthorized RCRA, they adopted the regulatory determination and said, states, you go do it for the very reasons that you mentioned.
And Mr. Chairman, a follow-up to that, does the industry have any opinion or do you have any knowledge of places in Ohio that might be best suited for injection wells because of the geological differentiation between eastern Ohio, for example, and central and southern Ohio?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cafaro, it's up and down eastern Ohio, and you'll find Class 1 and Class 2 wells across nearly two-thirds of the state of Ohio, I would imagine. So what drives that? Where you can find a reservoir that has suitable permeability and porosity characteristics to accept that waste, and in and of itself would not be an oil and gas producer.
Just a few more, Mr. Chairman. I promise, and I unfortunately have to drive to Columbus at noon, so I'm trying to get it all out. Mr. Chairman, would the industry be willing to consider supporting codifying being responsible for paying for infrastructure damage related to activity? Many of our political subdivisions, townships in particular, do not have the resources available for infrastructure repair. And I'm curious to know whether or not the industry would be willing to actually have that codified to be a partner to be responsible for the repair to infrastructure like roads.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cafaro, the industry right now is currently in negotiations with local government at a table that is being hosted, facilitated by the Department of Transportation, to work out what's called a RUMA agreement, a road use maintenance agreement, a model agreement between industry, primarily the shale industry, and local government on how roads will be maintained going forward. Having said that, if you look at the track record in Pennsylvania and other places where this activity has taken place, the industry has already voluntarily rebuilt infrastructure, rebuilt roads, even built it before the activity took place so they could withstand the weight limits, and have invested hundreds of millions of dollars to do so. And local government recognizes that. There is a complication with codifying it. When we did House Bill 278 back in 2004,
Yep.
and when we did Senate Bill 165, which primarily preempted to the oil and gas regulatory program the authority over all aspects of oil and gas development, local government came in under the 165 during the House debate, near the end of the House hearings, and said, we want to make sure that our authority delegated under the Ohio statute is not impacted by the preemptive authority underneath 1509.02. So and that was put into the bill at the request of municipal and township governments. And it made clear that nothing in 1509.02 could impact their authority over their roads. So they asked for and had specific instructions under the statute that you cannot confuse regulatory authority between state government over oil and gas operations and with local government over their roads. So that separation of power stands in the statute today at the request of local government. Therefore, you cannot codify in the oil and gas permit the ability to say, have you complied with the instructions from local government?
Well, Mr. Chairman, to the witness, I will certainly take a look at that. It's called the Ohio Revised Code for a reason. And
1509.02.
that certainly seems like it's an area, along with the zoning, that I'm going to have to address. My two final questions, first being, is there a capacity limit for an injection well to take on the brine? And if so, is it set by federal standards, state standards, or industry standard?
Mr. Chairman, there is not a capacity issue. The rules under the Department of Natural Resources tell us what pressures that we have to maintain and stay below. And the volume that can be injected is controlled by geology. It's controlled by the characteristics of the particular rock you're injecting into. But we're very much regulated on the pressure.
Okay.
So otherwise, there will be a point where the formation fills up
Right.
with enough water where you would exceed the maximum operating pressure assigned by the
Understood.
regulatory program.
Okay. And finally, Mr. Chairman, to the witness, I was actually I just saw on Vindy.com that the administration and ODNR has created an 8,000-foot limit for brine injection wells. Does the industry have an opinion on that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cafaro, I don't know how to respond to that. I guess I'd have to really understand what they said.
Okay. Thank you.
I couldn't read my iPad driving up today. And by the way, Section 1422 of the Federal Code, UIC.
Okay, Section 1422?
1422, Federal Code.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the committee for indulging my questions.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions before Representative Lutton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witness for coming today. I've got a couple questions. One of them has to do with the myths of fracking fluid. We hear that everything from banana peels to diesel fuel to leftover radioactive waste is being used in fracking fluids, and that no one can find out about what its constituent parts are or how to clean it up should it happen to come into contact with the surface or human beings. Can you explain to us the proprietary nature of fracking fluids, their constituent parts, and any of the other myths that are currently being circulated about that fluid?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lutson, thank you for the question. Fracturing fluids are 98 to 99% water. The reason you use water is that it's a hydraulic medium that's benign to the reservoir that you're going to be trying to stimulate. So it acts as a hydraulic lever to create a fracture that goes back into the reservoir rock, and you design that fracture to stay right within the reservoir rock so you can get all the oil and gas. There is chemicals that are used in this process. Down where I come from in southern Ohio, we frack the Clinton sandstone wells. Clinton sandstone has clay particles in it. So there's a thing called a stabilizer for clay that when you're putting fresh water by it, it coats the clay and doesn't allow it to swell, which would be counterproductive to what you're trying to do. Believe it or not, when you're pumping down 4.5 casing, 5,000 feet into the ground trying to do a frac job, you can create a lot of pressure and friction. So they add chemicals, surfactants, that actually lubricate the process in order to keep the pressure down on the pipe. There's all kinds of engineered ways to make sure that there is no damage to the formation when you inject fresh water into it, and that you accomplish the purpose that you're trying to achieve. The state of Ohio was the second state in the nation after Senate Bill 165. The state of Ohio was the second state in the nation to put in place into the Ohio statute full disclosure of frack chemicals. Pursuant to Senate Bill 165, when you complete a well, the point you put it into production, you're done constructing the well, you must hand in what's called a well completion report. According to Senate Bill 165, that report must have what's called the frack ticket. The frack ticket is a duplication of everything that went into that frack job from the very beginning, called the pad, to the very end, called the flush. At what stage it went in, how much it went in, and what it was. You also must, and this is not being done in any other states, you must also hand in what's called the frack chart. Frack chart, quite simply, is a graph, pressure and rate over time of the complete frack job. So if there was some kind of failure, if the pipe broke, if there's some kind of problem out there when that job happened, you would see that immediately displayed on the frack chart. You have to hand that in with the well completion report, and it's part of the public record. When we were negotiating in the final stages of 165 before the House Ag and Natural Resources Committee, the Ohio Environmental Council came in and said, well, this is great about the frack chart, and this is great about the frack ticket, but we want all the MSDS sheets that are associated with each one of those chemicals listed on the ODNR website. So at the request of the Ohio Environmental Council, and we supported their amendment, the ODNR must list all the MSDS sheets that are associated with any chemical, not just fracturing, with any chemical that's used in the oil and gas E&P process, and that must be posted on their website. Most MSDS sheets have the CAS number of the chemical in question, unless there's a proprietary issue. And let me get to that. Even with Frac Focus, which is Groundwater Protection Council's flagship website down in Oklahoma, where people list CAS numbers, they respected proprietary rights for chemicals from service industries that are competing with each other. We use the MSDS sheet, and you brought up in your opening comments that you were actually concerned not necessarily about the well site, but what happens in transportation, or as this stuff is moved across from service company yards to the well site or wherever. If we were to walk out of here and some truck came by and dumped a chemical on it, it would be the MSDS sheet that emergency responders will go to save you and my life. And that's why the state of Ohio accepted that standard. We have full disclosure in the state of Ohio, had it since August of 2010.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you. Where are, given the fact that the frac ticket, the frac chart are public record, where are they located? How does the public access those records? And are the MSDS sheets located, or information located at the same area, or is this one of those where, you know, we all call into some company and say press 1 for, you know, Lithuanian, press 2 for, so how does the public in a reasonable manner access the information that would be relevant to their area?
It's a very good question, Mr. Chairman. Representative Letson, the MSD sheets are listed on the ODNR website. And that was a requirement of the statute 165. In order to go see the well chart and the well ticket, you have to access what is called a public record, a well completion report. Also, the Department of Natural Resources, the Oil and Gas Regulatory Program, maintains a world-class system of called the well locator files, in which you can go and use their RBDMS database system to do research on any well drilled in the state of Ohio, including the completion reports and anything else you want to know, production records, anything about that well, logs, the whole deal. And you can still go on the website and do that. If I wanted to know if there was a well being drilled next to me and I want to know what was being done on that frac job, I would go to the Department of Natural Resources and I would say, I want the well completion report for this permit number, this well drilled in this township of this county.
Follow again, sir? Thank you. Turning to the well, the Mahoning Valley well, the Mahoning County well in question. And what Mr. Hill has said about the PSI ratings of the individual wells. And with some minuscule understanding that I have that DNR, and Mr. Hill, you might as well stand up because you're the one that's going to answer it. Mr. Stewart's going to go, you. I want to know about how the PSI limits are set. I want to know what happens if they are exceeded. I want to know if you can ask for waivers to increase the pressure that your particular well is pushing. So how are they set? Who sets them? And what happens when we exceed them? And can we ask for forgiveness rather than permission, or can we ask for permission?
Thank you very much, Senator, Mr. Lesson. Tom Tomastic, who works for the Department of Natural Resources, heads up the UIC program. And when we apply for a permit, we tell him at the top perforated interval, the top of the zone we're going to inject into, and then the state of Ohio has calculated a formula, and it's based on depth. And they take the depth of the formation it's being injected into, they run it through their calculation, and they give us a top pressure. Now that's based on the fact that they're saying that the water that comes into a facility is very briny, and if it has a lot of brine, it makes it heavier. If it's heavier, it goes in the ground easier. Without getting into the weeds on the engineering, they're calculating that this water is very heavy. That skews I won't say it skews the calculation, it makes the calculation so that we get a lower injection pressure. So to answer your question, the Department of Natural Resources has a formula. I think anyone would agree that it's a very conservative formula, that they give us a low pressure, and that's called a parting pressure. And the reason they do that is they want to make sure when we're injecting water into these formations that we're not getting to a pressure that exceeds the parting pressure and causes the well to fracture. So they're making us below that. Now, one of the things that they just changed in the permitting process a few weeks or months ago is that any new wells going forward, they have to be monitored, not by man or not, they have to have a recording chart, just like the frac charts Tom was referring to when we do frac jobs. There's going to be a chart, a continuous 24-hour chart, so that anyone can walk into an injection facility and see the chart on the wall or ask for the chart to prove that those pressures had not been exceeded. Now you ask what can we ask to be that change. The UIC program has a mechanism where if you're not accepting very heavy specific gravity brine, but it's a lighter brine, you can give them a sample of your water and they can adjust your pressures. But the pressure they use, the standard pressure they use, they're saying you're going in there, you're going to be putting in very heavy water, and that causes a lower injection pressure. So, but going forward on new wells, there will be continuous 24-hour monitoring that we will have to turn in.
Lastly, the method of, is there a method for a waiver or a way to request pressure deviation increase?
Yes, there is a mechanism, and again, we can ask for it, I think, once a quarter, and you take samples of the water that you're accepting, and you have an independent laboratory measure the specific gravity, and if you can prove to them that they should be using a different specific gravity in your formula, you can ask for a waiver. But you have to continually give them samples so that you can maintain that waiver. It's not a carte blanche, I got it waived and then tomorrow I'll bring in different water. You have to continually ask for that waiver.
Lastly, Mr. Chair, back to Mr. Stewart. You indicate in your testimony that fracking has a history in Ohio of some 60-plus years. My understanding is that there is a difference between the early fracking, which I will describe as vertical fracking, versus what we're going on today, which is horizontal fracking. And could you give me when the switch over from the old method of fracturing to the new directional drilling, and from the new directional drilling to the new directional horizontal fracturing.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lutzen, that rock down there at 6,000 or 7,000 feet doesn't know whether a pipe's going through it vertically or whether it's going through horizontally. It makes no difference to that reservoir. All it knows is that somebody perforated a hole, a round hole, at some point in that reservoir rock and applied hydraulic pressure to it. That reservoir will not behave any differently, hydraulically fracturing, if it's vertical or with it's horizontal. The only thing about horizontal drilling is that it exponentially increases the face of the reservoir rock to the well bore. And the way to think of a horizontal well is like 25 wells inside one well bore. The frac job that is applied in 1952 in the state of Ohio is the exact same principle that's being applied today anywhere. It's a hydraulic fracture job. You apply hydraulic pressure to bring a break in the rock. And it's the same way. Nothing has changed as far as how hydraulic fracturing and rock mechanics interact with each other.
The history, when do we go horizontal on fracturing in the country, in the state?
Horizontal drilling, obviously we've been drilling vertical wells now for 150 years. Horizontal drilling is a process that really began as a production process in the Permian Basin, the Austin Chalk area of South Texas. And it was a production process where they went into very old fields. For example, they thought the Austin Chalk was done, depleted. And they started horizontally cutting it, and they made much new, greater production. Again, because horizontal drilling is like drilling your frac job, is one way to think of it. Then they started applying it to completion techniques in the resource shale play, particularly the Barnett of North Texas and around Dallas-Fort Worth, in which they went along the horizontal lateral and at various points along the horizontal lateral completed a well. Each one of those acts like an individual well within the shale bed. And they complete a well, frack it, complete a well, frack it, complete a well, frack it. So in effect, like 25 wells. Am I correct here? It's like 25 wells that are being done inside one well bore. Horizontal drilling has been applied in the Marcellus shale play for the last 6 years. The very first Marcellus well of the Martin era was actually a vertical well in Washington County, Pennsylvania. One of my members made the decision they thought they had a dry hole down below. They made a decision to try to frack the Marcellus and see how it would behave. They did it vertically, made just one great well, and that kicked off the Marcellus boom, Range Resources in Pennsylvania. But again, there's this myth out there that somehow this term horizontal hydrofracking or whatever, there's nobody in the industry that understands what horizontal hydrofracking is. You know, it's a term that nobody uses except one you see in the media. A frac job's a frac job. Have we gotten more sophisticated on how to protect the reservoir? Yeah. Have we gotten more sophisticated on how to place proppant back into the frac job? Yes. When my father did his first frac job in 1954 in Marion Township, Hocking County, they used crude oil as the medium. Because the thinking was, well, crude oil is native to the reservoir, so we couldn't hurt it. Except crude oil is sort of flammable, and it wasn't a good process. And actually, my father did one of the very first jobs in Marion Township, Hocking County, using water, 1956, Dobmeyer number 4. Made a great well when they thought it was a dry hole. That process has essentially not changed. Scale's gotten bigger, better ways to do things. That's how technology develops. Same principle. Same thing.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Hagan. Chairman. Tom, thank you very much for giving us a great example of what a filibuster is. Let me ask you a couple of questions. Yeah, you referenced my father's bill in 1984, 501, House Bill 501, the ponds for evaporation pits that were being used. The industry claimed that there would be, along with the Chamber of Commerce, claimed that there would be an advent of 200,000 jobs because of the drilling of the Marcellus and Utica Shale. And now, because of what you just mentioned, as a matter of fact, you just mentioned in Washington County where the individual drilled a vertical well that we're finding out now that because of an injection well there, the safe area of the state, according to the ODNR and the industry, we now have valid proof that there are earthquakes in that section of the state. Are you aware of what's going on there, A? And then B, with the fact that you needed to be brought to the legislature because of 501, because the industry was in fact just dumping the brine, so-called brine, and the chemicals in these ponds, why should we trust you now?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hagan, I was there when 501 was done, and I was younger then, so are you, and the area I was referencing was Washington County, Pennsylvania, which is where the Marcellus Shale, first Marcellus Shale.
That'll be my next question.
The disposal wells that are commercially operating inside Washington County are not operating at basement levels. In fact, they're operating in a very common formation, the Clinton sandstone, which is thousands of feet, 3,000 feet from the basement rocks. Nobody has, I think, attempted to make a link that whatever earthquake happened in Washington County, Ohio, is related to the UIC wells beyond the circumstantial evidence that UIC wells are there and an earthquake happened. Earthquakes happen all the time, and I think the department has not made a conclusion that it's related to UIC activity. I have felt earthquakes in Fairfield County, not too far away. I've witnessed that in my time. I'm not sure, Bob, I'm not sure why I would expect you to believe me, except that you and I have known each other for 20 years, and I think my reputation down at the General Assembly is sterling. Other than that,
Mr. Chairman, Tom, I'm not talking about it personal. I'm talking about the industry.
You don't have to believe me, or you don't have to believe the industry. I will point to the statistics of Class 2 injection across the state of Ohio and across the United States, which I referred to in my testimony. The overwhelming evidence is that it's safe, and actually it's the preferred method under the landmark federal laws. I think 501 was badly needed. It was a traumatic event for industry at that time. We've talked about your dad, we'll talk about my dad. He grew up in the 40s and 50s in the oil and gas industry. He didn't like 501, and my response to him, as I was well tending for him, was, you can't put water in pits. Look what you're doing. I think 501 was badly needed. And the solution to the issue was the proper way. Use UIC, use Class 2 to manage that stream. And the industry has complied and made a very effective and efficient way of using that. And that's been the history since 1985 when the law became part of the books.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
And I appreciate that. My point was that the industry does not initiate these type of actions. They are always dragged kicking and screaming to the legislative process.
I dispute that, Representative. In fact, I was at the lead in doing Senate Bill 165, and I take a lot of pride in how that was crafted underneath Senate Pro Tem Tom Niehaus and under Dave Hall over in the Ohio House. Senate Bill 165, most people who are familiar with regulatory policy across the United States consider 165 to be the most significant amendment to oil and gas law of the 33 producing states and very forward-leaning. And the stronger report and the state review process that came in after 165 was put in place backed that up, and that was signed off by the environmental community, who also had representatives on that review team who were opposed to 165 when it was being considered in the last General Assembly. And you didn't bring kicking or screaming me to the table to do 165. I was there at every step to try to make that the best bill we possibly could, including doubling funding for the Oil and Gas Agency, including revising enforcement authority, including updating how we do well construction practices so that it meets the modern challenges. Frac disclosure was my idea, State Representative Hagan.
Mr. Chairman.
One more question, please.
Thank you. There seems to be some issue that was raised in the New York Times article relative to the 3-year moratorium that the New York Times had, but then it moved rather rapidly to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania now bars any injection into their wastewater treatment plants for A, the unknown chemicals in some cases, B, the possibility of radiation that is not being looked at or viewed, and C, they have then decided that they have banned the use of that and the disposal of it in the wastewater treatment plants, and then they ship it to Ohio. Why would you not support the same moratorium that we're offering to at least find out what all those chemicals are doing to the people in the state of Ohio?
Mr. Chairman. In the state of Pennsylvania, they don't have primacy, for one thing. They also do not, their formations, because you move into the Appalachian geosyncline at a rate of about 75 feet dip per mile as you move down into the basin, everything in Pennsylvania is deeper, and if it's deeper, there's the potential for it to be tighter in permeability. There's only very few Class II wells that accept oil field brines in the state of Pennsylvania. One of them was done pursuant to a study by US EPA, as I found out last week. The solution in Pennsylvania then has been to use POTWs to compete with other industries who want to put their waste stream into rivers and streams.
One final.
I have personally opposed that. And I went to the Strickland administration, who issued the first POTW to the city of Warren and said, don't do it. And I went to the Kasich administration when they came in and said, don't do it. Because I know, to me, it's a political issue. One, the oil and gas industry over there was competing with all these other industries who all wanted to use the river as their sewer, legally. So that was causing stress. But I could sit here, I know I can't convince these people, but I know I can't convince you that you could clean that water till it's absolutely distilled, and I'm never going to convince you that it was a good thing to put that into a river or stream, correct?
No, that's not correct at all. If you can convince me, and the science convinces me that, in fact, it's clean,
I think we've got a ways to go on that. So generally,
you certainly do.
So generally, what we're talking about here is POTWs, correct?
Correct.
We're talking about POTWs. State of Ohio doesn't allow that to happen, and they denied the permit of the one that existed in the state of Ohio. It doesn't benefit the Ohio industry, whether there's a POTW in Cleveland.
Well, Mr. Chairman, the last thing here, Tom, is that the primacy issue is an important issue for the state of Ohio. We all understand that we relinquished that, the feds relinquished that back to us. The ODNR makes those decisions. But on the other hand, the fines and the requirements that they stay up to date are actually lower than the US EPA standards. They are the minimum of the US EPA standards. They do not exceed it. So the state of Ohio is actually below the highest standards that are issued in other states. The state of Ohio is lax in those regulations.
They meet all the states, all the standards. They have to meet the same standards as Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. Otherwise, they would not have primacy.
Senator Schiavone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief because I want the scientists to be able to testify before everybody has to go for dinner or something. So, but I want to.
I'm letting them off the hook here. So
No, this is a question. I just want to talk about recycling a little bit. I mean, when I was little, I was taught that recycling was beneficial to the environment because you use less resources and you have less waste. So, I think that, or I'm asking, does this same mind thought exist in the oil and gas industry? So wouldn't it be beneficial to use less water in the first place and then inject less water in the second, afterwards? So before and after the process, would this be beneficial? Is this existing? Is this something we're looking at?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Schiavone, the shale industry, based upon their history in Pennsylvania, has quickly moved to near close 100% recycling of frac fluids. That's economically efficient, and it reduces stress on water acquisition needs. So that is happening.
Is it happening sometimes? Is it happening a little bit? Is it happening a lot?
They're compelled to do it because of water acquisition issues. It makes sense. It takes large operations to do it. but acquiring water resources for this type of process is expensive. So one, they're compelled to do it for economic reasons, and two, they're compelled to do it for social reasons. And they're close to 100% recycling now on frac.
And I believe I heard you say that the more dense the water is, the easier it is to go down.
Weight.
So,
Yep.
so would that disincentivize you to recycle it?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I think you're confusing two different processes. What Mr. Hill was referring to is that when you're injecting into a UIC facility, based upon the concentration of salt in the water, that adds weight. The more weight, the more hydrostatic pressure on the reservoir, the less pressure you will see at the surface.
And the less energy you would have to use to push it.
That's for Class 2 injection. For hydraulic fracturing operations, you need clean water. In order to do a hydraulic fracturing operation, you may damage the formation. So they're not going to use an oil field brine to go back and do a frac job.
Understand.
They wouldn't do that.
Well, could we get some numbers for folks and for the legislators about the recycling of the water and what percentage of the time that's used?
And Mr. Chairman, this whole issue of PODWs, the technology is clearly coming close where you can refine this water to the point where it exceeds drinking water standards. And that's something we need to look at. The political issues today say that it's difficult, and that's been the decision of this administration.